Hello, I'm Dr. David Trembath, Research Fellow at the Olga Tennison Autism Research Centre at La Trobe University. I'm joined here today by Professor Cheryl Dissanayake, Director of the Centre. Cheryl was recently appointed Professor, and we've come here today to reflect on her journey as a researcher in the field of autism spectrum disorders, to talk about the current activities of the Olga Tennison Autism Research Centre, and to look to the future, to some of the changes we might expect in the field of autism, both in terms of research and service provision. So Cheryl, welcome.
Thank you, David.
Can we go back to the beginning? How did you become interested and involved in research in the field of autism?
It was a lecture that I was a third-year student at Monash University studying psychology. And my lecturer at that time, she was Dr. Stella Crosley, gave us a lecture on autism. She was a behaviour geneticist and her research was on Drosophila melanogaster. But she, which is a fruit fly for those of you who don't know, but she had this unit on child ethology, and she talked about how the approach in studying child behaviour had been used in studying young children with autism, and she referred to some work by Corinne and John Hutt in the 60s. And listening to that work, I just got hooked in. So that would have been 1982, and I've never been bored since then. Professor Stella Crosley ultimately was my honours supervisor, and I worked in the area of attachment in typically developing children for my honours. And then for my PhD, I worked in the area of autism and undertook a very detailed study of behaviour in these children, because there really still wasn't good data on really fine detailed behavioural descriptions of these children. And so that's the approach. I use the child ethology approach to study children with autism with a real focus on whether these children develop attachments to their primary caregivers. And Stella supervised me and was my mentor really throughout many, many years.
And what's changed over the years? What are some of the major developments that you've seen in the field of autism?
Oh, that's been huge, really. So I started in 1984, undertaking my PhD, and back then we were still we were sort of 41 years after Kanner had originally described these children and these 11 cases, but we were still very much working within Kanner's autism. We referred to early infantile autism or childhood autism. DSM-3 was the platform, the diagnostic platform that we were working with, and then we went into DSM-3R while I was undertaking my PhD. And we thought about autism being one condition, a unique condition. We didn't think about it being a syndrome. We talked about childhood autism as being one thing, and we were searching for the cause of autism, and we were trying to delineate the core features of this condition. So when we think about where we are now, we were working within quite a narrow framework. But a lot of really important work had been done when I came into the field. Britain was really, the UK were leading the way, I think, in autism research and had done some really excellent work in the late 60s and early 70s. People like Michael Rutter, who's now Sir Michael Rutter, his PhD student, Laurie Bartak, who is now, our very own Australian Laurie Bartak, who's done so much work in autism in Australia. They had really charted the cognitive abilities of these children. People like Beata Hermelin and Neil O'Connor. Neil O'Connor's another Australian, had also set down some very clear experimental work, sort of charting the way. Uta Frith was coming into the area of autism, and then in the UK had started work in the 80s. So that British work really was done in the late 60s and 70s. And then the researchers in the United States really started moving the biological work forward. So people like Ed Ritvo and Ed Ornitz at UCLA were looking at this as a biological disorder. The Iva Lovas had just begun looking at treatment using ABA, again work at UCLA. So the Americans were now sort of taking to the fore. So it was a very exciting time really to come into the field. And you know, we were really trying to build on this sort of groundwork that had been done. People like Christopher Gillberg were working in Sweden and really charting the course as well in the area of autism. But it's just so different now.
If Leo Kanner was here today, do you think he'd be surprised by what he sees in terms of the changes in the field, the developments? What do you think he'd be excited by?
Yeah, I haven't reflected on that. I did write a paper about sort of looking back for 50 years since Leo Kanner had first charted autism. I think, you know, one thing I should say about Leo Kanner's exacting behavioural descriptions is that in many ways we haven't moved that far from those 11 cases he charted. I mean, we think about autism very differently now. So I think he would be pleased that some of those core features he described are still used today. I think he would be shocked of what we call autism. I mean, Leo Kanner called autism this very narrow thing, and even when I came into the field in the early 80s, we already knew that these children all didn't have their full intellectual potential, for example, that some children did, but some children did have intellectual impairments. They weren't able to learn in the same way, whereas Leo Kanner saw these sort of high-functioning children. And those are the kinds of children that Hans Asperger also charted. But I think if they came today and saw what we call autism now, in the full spectrum of conditions, you know, that we now understand autism to be, and the many disorders that we understand autism to be, I think they would be shocked. I think Leo Kanner did chart this as a biological condition initially, and of course we're right in there with him still, you know, that these are indeed biological conditions. So I think he should be very proud really in his exacting description and initial understandings about autism. I guess we've journeyed a long way, but you know, we still make reference to Kanner's autism to describe those kind of classical children, you know, who have more involved autism.
Certainly. And it has been a long journey, and your journey as a researcher, obviously you've come into contact with many great people, and I imagine you'd have mentors who would have supported you, helped you along the way. Who are some of the people who have had an influence on your career?
Oh yes, many. You know, no one person travels alone, and I really strongly believe that. And in my academic career, of course, my first mentor would have been Stella Crosley, Professor Stella Crosley. You know, she introduced me to an area she didn't work in deeply herself, but that she supported me all along the way. And, you know, I look at our researchers at the Olga Tennison, and I'm sort of jealous of them in a way, because they have this fantastic company, you know. People like you and Giacomo and Mandy, you know, we're working as a team. Whereas I was very much working as one person in a university with a mentor, but she provided me with such guidance and encouragement. You know, she'd insist I'd go to certain conferences, and she'd introduce me to people. And my very first conference I went to, first international conference, I met Temple Grandin. Right. And, you know, Temple was a PhD student in the United States. So, you know, she kind of opened up the world to me as much as she could, so certainly Stella Crosley. But then other people like Laurie Bartak, who had his door open to me anytime I wanted to speak with him. My head of school, Professor Ross Day, who I've journeyed with right from the time I was an undergraduate student. So I had this I sort of grew up in an experimental psychology environment in the department at Monash, which was a really stellar department. So I had a lot of mentors in the staff there, but then more autism-specific mentors. As I sort of started travelling in autism, Professor Margot Pryor, who marked one of my early essays, and which wasn't a very good essay, but had been marked really poorly. And so they called her in as a sort of a third marker, and she said, "It's not brilliant, but it's not bad." And and so I've journeyed with her, and she's still my mentor. And I really think these mentorships are just so valuable. And then when I left Monash, I went to UCLA. And it was really at UCLA that I became a developmental psychologist under the mentorship of Professor Marion Sigmund. She knew at the heart of what it was to be a developmental psychologist, and she really, I think, was one of the first people that brought in developmental into autism. And what we talk about autism now and our research in autism is so much based on so much work that came out of Professor Sigmund's lab. So she was another mentor. And then coming back to Australia and resuming my relationships with people like Professor Margot Pryor and Ross Day. Stella is no longer, but also Stella, has just meant that I could proceed in a very guided way and having sounding boards. And for everybody, I remember Professor Isabel Rapin, who's a researcher, quite a now very senior, aged researcher in autism in the US. She gave, when she got the Lifetime Achievement Award at IMFA some years ago, and she said to all those, she targeted this to women, to all those young women researchers, get yourself a good man. And I would say to all those young autism researchers, male or female, get yourself a good partner that supports you in your journey, but also get yourself a good mentor, because everyone needs one.
Absolutely. Well, as a professor in the School of Psychological Science at La Trobe and also director of the centre, you have so many roles and responsibilities, but yet you still prioritise mentoring, supervising students and early career researchers. Why?
Well, really, I think that's the best part of most of our jobs, I think, as academics. I often say, you're only as good as your students, really, in this field, in any field. I think in being a scientist and a researcher and an academic, if you can attract good students and then mentor them well, what you get is, first of all, a wonderful journey of discovery with the people you work with. And then they eventually become your colleagues, and that transition for me from being a fully fledged student into some kind of mentorship that you have to manage, and there are tough times, as you know, with supervisors. It's not always smooth, but eventually that student becomes they surpass you. They become, you have a passion about something and you agree to work in an area and you mentor them in that area, and really quite quickly they overtake you in that area because they become the expert in that area. And then they move beyond your lab and out into the world, and then take those skills and abilities, and they become your colleagues, your peers, and they're the ones who are reading your grants. And I think that's a really nice journey, and I think that's one that I would always prioritize. It becomes tougher as you get pulled into more tasks, but I think without our students, life wouldn't be as good. And I just think you don't move the field. You can't do everything on your own. So you have to work with other people, and working with your students is a real bonus.
Certainly. Well, we have approximately 40 staff and students in the OTARC. And working across a variety of projects. And I'm wondering if we can focus on just a couple of areas of research today. Firstly, in terms of understanding autism and early diagnosis, what are some of the projects or the questions you're looking at that in the centre at the moment, and why is it important?
Yes, we do have a big focus within the centre in the early years. And I guess the focus is because I think there's so much possibility there. So focusing on the early years, I don't want to withdraw at all or take anything away from the whole journey is important, the whole lifespan. We need to understand the entire lifespan of in autism spectrum conditions, and really try and work out how to support people across that lifespan. But I do believe that in focusing very early, we may need to focus less later on. If we get it right early. So I became interested in the very early autism phenotype, and so some of the early work I did, and this was even before we had the centre, so with PhD students like Sally Clifford, was interview parents and couple those interviews with looking at home videotapes about the first 2 years of life. What did those babies look at? Babies who already had a diagnosis of autism, what were the nuances? You know, could we seek signs, early signs? And that work, and also work from other labs, not just my own, convinced us that we could actually use those very early signs to then identify children having autism at an earlier age. And so when I came into the field, children were diagnosed between 4 and 6, and many not till much later. So we were just really trying to bring diagnosis earlier and earlier. And so what we tried to do is work within the maternal and child health system. I got a grant to look at whether we could use children's maternal and child health records to identify signs of autism. And so we did a project, and we found, in fact, that the records weren't fine enough. While the behaviours were there, nurses were much more focusing on the physical growth of the baby and whether the baby was sleeping, and sort of things that parents were really concerned about. So that sort of convinced me that we really had to get into training of nurses to bring together these early signs that we knew were there in these very young babies. And we applied for a grant, and I had a wonderful PhD student who was very, very keen to work on this project, and this is now Dr. Josephine Barbaro, who's one of your colleagues. Yes. And Josie worked on the social attention and communication study. And we showed very clearly from that study that we could, through a universal primary care system, identify these children who are at risk of developing autism. We could identify them and then diagnose them by the time they were 2 years. And the idea about doing that was so that we could then start interventions very early. And I guess I truly believe if you can get that child between 18 to 24 months, identify that child and start working using effective treatments, treatments which have a good underlying behavioral analysis system, and using techniques like pivotal response training, a good developmental approach, you can move that child toward a more normal developmental trajectory. So I guess that's really why we're focusing in that early age, and now working in the area of early identification, diagnosis, as well as early intervention, because we can alter futures really. And I think the problem we will be dealing with then will be much smaller.
Yes.
Because a problem at 2 is a much smaller problem than a problem at 6 or 8. And then if we put in the right supports, I think the supports further down the line will be less and less. So, but I think even with that, some children with autism will always need more support than other children. But it's also trying to then find out, well, which children need what support. So again, if we can get that right and get that done early, I think we can change the A word. I think of the A word, the autism word, being very scary to parents. It's sort of like the C word, the cancer word in a doctor's clinic. I think that A will just become a smaller A, and that we can, the earlier we can move to get these children into a system of supports and for their families.
So what you've learned from studying, early diagnosis in Victoria, Australia, autism's a global, issue, I guess, or a global issue. Is what you're learning from your work in early diagnosis here in Australia relevant to other parts of the world?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, first of all, that work I was charting, the social attention and communication study that Josie did, has now formed the basis of our early assessment clinic at OTAC. So that, as you know, David, because you work in that clinic, we only see children in that clinic under 3 years, because we know we've got that expertise to have those children in. And I think we've built now the science around that and practice. So what we're trying to do is, it's absolutely relevant internationally. So we're engaging a lot in Asia. We're training in lots of countries like I've trained in China and Japan, and Josie's trained in South Korea. We've trained in Poland. Josie will be traveling to Bangladesh next month to train there on early signs and to promote early identification. And internationally, I think that's the way to go. You know, we have a lot of knowledge now, and I think we have to engage in global knowledge translation, particularly to countries that don't have access to English, and so don't have access to the literature, because the research, much of the research is still taking place in Western industrialized nations. We know a lot about autism in white middle-class children. We really need to understand autism in other countries. We need to do many more cross-cultural studies. We need to look at how other cultures deal with children with autism. There are children with autism in all these countries, so we really need to work with each other and get to a kind of global understanding of autism, rather than where we're at right now. So I think any work anyone does in autism is immediately relevant internationally, because this is an international issue.
Certainly.
Yeah.
And if we identify children early, if we diagnose and understand their learning early, you mentioned that early intervention is then possible. What's the state of evidence in relation to early interventions for children with autism, and what's OTAC doing to contribute to the building of that research, understanding and evidence?
I think actually that's some of the most exciting parts of autism internationally, is the steps we've made toward identifying what works, towards getting to a really good evidence-based practice in very early interventions for children with an autism spectrum disorder. I think science has moved forward a lot. Our understandings are a lot better around early interventions. Where we're lacking, I think, is still getting those good interventions, where we know the interventions that are efficacious, into the community, disseminating them into community settings. So taking them from our university labs into the community. So you asked within the centre what we're doing there, and we now of course have the Margot Pryor Wing, which is the Victorian Autism Specific Early Learning and Care Centre. So this is a federally funded centre. It's one of 6 across Australia, and we're very lucky to have one of these centres at La Trobe, where we also have our research centre, because it really means we're able to very effectively begin to research on the early intervention models we're using within this centre. And I think that we're poised really to do this very difficult research, taking research from the lab into a community setting, and having one on campus is, enormously helpful. So just to go back to the kinds of interventions which we know work, we know ABA, ABA principles that underpin interventions are very, very effective. We know that interventions with a good developmental focus that works with the child at the developmental stage that the child is at are very effective. Ones, when we're talking about diagnosing early, identifying and diagnosing early, what we're talking about is infancy and toddlerhood, all right? And so you can't sit an infant and toddler at a desk and teach them to draw. So the interventions have to be naturalistic. They have to be based within everyday routines, within the home, within childcare. And so these interventions now are being much more developmentally focused to work with these very young children. And the Early Start Denver model is one such intervention that we're working with at the Margot Pryor Wing. And while this is a model that's being used one-to-one, where you work as a therapist or a parent with your child, we're looking to bring this model into a group setting, and we're just delighted with the results we're getting. We've got a fantastic set of staff at the Margot Prior Wing who are so committed to making this model work as a group so that it's more feasible. Parents take their children to childcare, and how marvellous that, you know, you pay childcare fees, but your child with autism gets an intervention that's suited to them whilst they're at childcare. So these are sort of models that we're researching how effective it is. What's the cost effectiveness of these models? So I think autism science in intervention is really growing, and what's really growing too is the idea that we can shift the way these little brains are developing, you know, so the earlier you work with these children, the more malleable their brains are. The brains are in a stage of development, and if you're effectively working with them with good intervention, you're really altering the way you're helping that child to rewire the important networks, the social networks, those networks that underpin communication and social responsiveness. So I think with the brain imaging techniques and, you know, our technologies are also allowing us to work to look at the effectiveness of our interventions. I just think it's hugely exciting. I mean, Leo Kanner didn't even think about interventions, you know, and here we are talking about altering developmental trajectories. So I just think it's a very, very exciting future.
And what's the ultimate goal for a child with autism born today, or a young child with autism today? What are we hoping for the future in terms of adulthood, you know?
I think people with autism will always maintain a difference, you know. They're born autistic, and some people may no longer meet autism criteria further down the line. The majority will meet criteria, but what we want is for their lives to be easier, you know. We're not against autism. Autism brings a whole lot of strengths, but it also has some weaknesses. So I think what we want to do is work with those weaknesses so their lives aren't as difficult, you know. I don't think people with autism necessarily want to be, you know, number one in the pecking order and the most sociable kid in the class. And the parents may not want that either, you know, but they have every right to expect that they'll be able to go to be educated and be supported in that education. They have every right to expect that they can participate in the community as an autistic person and be accepted in the community. And they have every right to expect that we'll help them to work with some of those weaknesses and address them, be able to support them so they can then be effective in addressing areas that, you know, where they don't feel they have strengths. So I think if you ask a parent of a child with autism what you want, they don't necessarily want for their child to be cured, you know. They want their child to be accepted. They want their child to have some friends. They want their child to be able to have a job. To go to school, to, you know, be educated and to have a job and to have a meaningful life. And I think, you know, to be able to contribute to society ultimately. So if we can help them on that journey, I think that's really where we want to get to at OTAC, to look at that journey across the developmental span. And so while we do have a focus in the early years, it's about building capacity in the later years.
Well, earlier this year, the federal government announced a cooperative research centre, funding for a centre that was titled Living with Autism Spectrum Disorders. And that will bring together partners, research partners and industry partners from around Australia, of which La Trobe University and the Olga Tennison Autism Research Centre is one. What do you think the CRC, the Cooperative Research Centre, will mean for research in autism in Australia? And what are some of the outcomes we might expect?
Okay, that's a big question. An important one though, I think. And I think I'd like to sort of first preface anything I say by saying that the Cooperative Research Centre, so I'm going to call it the CRC, for Living with Autism Spectrum Disorders, has an end-user driven focus. So these CRC programs is not about researchers having wonderful ideas and the government funding those ideas. There are different granting schemes to do that. The CRC is about addressing problems and addressing needs in the community. So that's what I mean. It's driven by the end user. What does the clinician sitting in her office need from us? What does a teacher sitting in her classroom of 25 kids with 3 with autism in that classroom, what do they need from us? So the questions come from the end user. So in doing this, the research that we undertake within the CRC is very focused, very applied to addressing questions that are relevant to the community around autism. So we've got 3 core program areas in the CRC. There's 7 universities involved. I mean, it's very exciting. It's the first truly national collaborative research project around autism. And I think it will be a game changer. Not just for the research, but also for people with autism, parents of children with autism, clinicians who deal with autism, and so on. Okay, so the core program areas that we want to address is, first of all, to get diagnosis right, to identify and diagnose early and accurately. And so the blue sky outcome there is that we can integrate biological and behavioral knowledge and come up with a very effective and efficient means of diagnosing these very complex conditions, right? Now we're talking about hundreds of conditions, which we call autism. That's our first core area. The second is around, we didn't focus on intervention because we are doing pretty well in intervention science, early intervention science, and the government's also given a fair bit of money to early intervention and research in early intervention. So where we're not doing well is in educating our kids. So the second core program area is around how best to educate children with autism right from primary school right up to the end of high school. What programs are needed, what supports are needed. So that's the second core program area. And the third core program area is about creating a future. And that's to look at how we can support people with autism to transition into into tertiary education, into the workplace, to create a future for them so that they too can contribute meaningfully. So it really is a lifespan approach taken from, first signs to adulthood. Even looking to, we know nothing about how people with autism age, for example. So I think in all of this, our hope and our expectation, not just our hope, is we'll be able to change practice in autism spectrum disorders in Australia and possibly internationally as well, because this is such a large collaborative effort. It involves researchers in universities and research centres like our own. It involves end users. It involves community participation. It involves industry partners. I've never been involved in anything like it. We've been funded for 8 years, and we have very clear outputs that we expect. So I think it'll change the way we research autism in this country and change the way we practice around autism in this country. So I think I think it's very timely with the NDIS also about to, I was just beginning to now, of course, roll out the trials for the NDIS.
Well, absolutely. Just in the last couple of weeks, both the federal government and also the opposition have both announced that they will fully support the implementation of the NDIS. What do you think it will mean in terms of changes in services in Australia, or the availability of services? And probably more importantly, what should government do to ensure that money is spent where it's needed and spent wisely and well?
I'll answer the second part of that question first, I think. I think the NDIS is a wonderful, wonderful initiative. It's a long time coming, an enormous amount of lobbying. So it's just so wonderful to, know that we're going into the trials now. What should government do? I think, I have a lot of hope, but I have some fears. And I think those fears are shared with many people. I really think we need to get the bureaucracy around the NDIS right. It'll be so important that it's well managed, because we really have wonderful possibilities now, I think. and it needs to be managed very, very effectively. I also worry around management, around service provision. So we know when bodies of money become available, that it brings out dodgy practitioners. I mean, that's in anything, right? I mean, it's in the case of the roof bats, insulation, yes, and so on. So I think there are risks, and we have to be very, very cautious about that. So the government really needs to know about the supports that are needed to support people with disability, be that disability be acquired or inherited, whatever, you know. We need to have good evidence around the practices that will be supported and that we know makes a difference for people with disabilities. So I think that's very, very important. And the government, I think, will need to look at, you know, research across all of these areas of disabilities and know what supports are most efficacious. So I think it's a time where researchers and bureaucrats really need to be, you know, getting into the same rooms and talking a lot with one another. In the area of autism, which of course is, you know, is our interest here, I would hope that we do have a much stronger evidence base for you know, supports and services for what works, certainly around the early childhood years. I would hope that a child with autism, a newly diagnosed child with autism, you do assessments each week, David, and when you tell a parent that the child is meeting criteria for an autism spectrum disorder, I would hope that family could receive the full service that they need. If that is 20 hours of early intervention a week as a minimum, then that the NDIS would be able to fund that, because they would know that this sort of service is important for this sort of child, and that child would receive that service, that there'd be no bartering, well, we know your child needs 20 hours, but we can fund 1.5 hours a week. I mean, that to me, the NDIS has to put an end to that story.
But does it pay off? Is there evidence to suggest that early intervention does have a cost benefit?
Oh, absolutely. And economists now are starting to look at the cost benefits. In fact, I've just come back from the International Meeting for Autism Research, which was held in San Sebastian in Spain. And I was at a very exciting talk by Professor David Mandel, who is looking at interventions and doing the cost benefit, you know, effectiveness studies. And in fact, he was looking at the early start Denver model. That's why I was particularly interested in it, in looking at the provision of this one-to-one and showing the benefits over the early years of that child's life. And that's just going to accumulate as the child gets older. And, you know, we're now doing the early start Denver model in a group setting. So I really want to look at the cost effectiveness of that, because it should be even greater, right? So, you know, we do have evidence that our early interventions do alter outcomes for young children. Deb Fine does a lot of work in this area, looking at kids who have optimal outcomes and what predicts optimal outcomes. And things like, you know, the number of hours that child spends in early intervention improves outcomes. The age at which the child came into that early intervention improves the outcomes. But the intervention has to have a strong evidence base. We need to know that interventions have the necessary effective ingredients to address each child's individual profile.
Certainly. In looking forward to the future, what role do you think OTARC and the research at OTARC can play in shaping and changing and pushing forward our understanding of autism and supports and services that can be provided to, as you say, support people to live with autism across a lifespan?
Well, just even in setting up OTARC, and you know, you asked me about mentors, and I'd be remiss if I didn't put a name that has changed my life, and of course that's Mrs. Olga Tennison. She gave us the money to establish this centre, and that simple act of generosity has just had such knock-on effects in research in autism. So now we don't only have the research centre, we have, you know, an early assessment clinic, we have the Victorian Autism Specific Early Learning and Care Centre on campus, and there's research going on around all of this. she has really helped us and supported us to be able to work at the very nexus of research and practice, so that, you know, we can address real world problems within a very strict academic scholarly framework within the research centre, and yet be able to undertake research, you know, in everyday environments that our children with autism are in. So I think that act of generosity has really sort of brought a focus in autism research. It's the first research centre in Australia to be dedicated to autism spectrum disorders, and I think that was a change in how, you know, in just bringing that kind of clear focus onto autism. I think we've been able to work now not just with researchers like yourselves and people like Amanda Richdale and, you know, Christelle Hudry and so on. We've been able to gather a lot of autism expertise into this centre. But also, I think what's been important is that we've been able to join forces with people in the community, with services in the community, we've been able to have conversations with government, which I think, you know, just wasn't possible before, with families, engaging in families who participate in our research, because without participants, we wouldn't have research, you know. So in being able to create a centre, I think we've created a possibility of great change in the sphere of autism, in working, first of all, across the lifespan, and in working with all the necessary stakeholders. So looking forward, for our centre, I also look at the ability to build capacity in other people. So it's not just about us doing research in autism in our centre, within the CRC and so on. One of our goals is to build autism capacity so that, you know, we had, when I started in 1984, we said 3 to 4 in 10,000 were affected. Now we're saying 1 in 100 are affected, and in fact, the CDC is saying 1 in 88. That's the Centre for Disease Control, and there's some indication that it's even greater than that. It might be, when you include school-age children, it may be 1 in 50. All right, so we need capacity out there in the field to be able to work with these numbers of children. Imagine those children becoming aged, and you know, and we know nothing about autism in older people. We need to research that. We need to understand how people with autism age. Are they more vulnerable to different sorts of diseases than people without autism? So I think in creating this kind of centre and creating a focus for autism, it allows us to work not just within the university, but within a much wider setting. And I really think that's the way forward. And, you know, the CRC is just, again, something else that, you know, is, again, makes our possibilities greater in Australia and internationally. We've got, you know, we've got a lot of work to do. I want to tell you one story, if I may. And that's when I left the lab at UCLA. I'd completed my postdoctoral fellowship, and it was time to come to Australia. And my mentor, that was at the end of 1995, and my mentor, Professor Marion Sigmund, said to me, it was just before the numbers just went crazy in autism. We were still, you know, we still thought of autism as, you know, around 5 in 10,000. And she said, you know, Cheryl, I think you need another branch, another arm to your research bow. And you need to focus on another group, another problem, because autism can't sustain your research. And I love Marion, and you know, she's passed away just a couple of years ago. But boy, she was wrong in that, because she didn't see what was to happen. And when she talked to me then, you know, because I came back here and it was right at the cusp of that huge increase in numbers internationally. And in fact, there's too much work. There's too much work for all of us to do. And for, even with 40 people at OTAC, there's a lot of work. So we need to build capacity in other people, because we've got, we've got a big job ahead of us, but an exciting one.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, Professor Dissanayake, thank you very much for sharing with us your experiences, the current work of the OTAC and the plans for the future.
Thank you, David.